Welcome back to our second session. Chris, please take it away.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Enterprise Best Practices for Azure AD Active Directory Summit, called Modern Azure AD Active Directory Security Best Practices. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, a 20-time Microsoft MVP, technology writer, and commercial astronaut candidate. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author that has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and has created numerous full-length video training courses. He's also published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column, both on redmondman.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who attended that last session. I hope you all enjoyed it. And so in this session, I want to talk about Azure AD and Active Directory security. Now, Active Directory security is a huge topic, even if you don't bring Azure AD into the picture. Entire books have been written on the subject, and I'm pretty sure I've probably even written one of those along the way at some point in time. The thing is, there are so many best practices associated with Azure AD and Active Directory security because it is a massive topic. And so it's really tough to come up with a definitive set of best practices to cram into an hour-long presentation. So what I'm going to be doing in this presentation is just trying to give you a variety, because there are several primary areas that you need to focus on with regard to securing your Active Directory and Azure AD environments. And so I'm going to try to pull a few best practices from each one of these different areas. So that's my plan for this presentation. Now, one of the things that I want to begin with is by talking about some of the types of attacks that occur against Active Directory, because it's really tough to talk about security unless you first know what the threats are that you're trying to secure against. Makes sense, right? So when it comes to attacks against your Active Directory, there are really two main types. And the terms that I'll use for this, and these are my own terms, I'm not sure that they're necessarily industry-specific terms, although they may be. But the two main types of attacks are what I like to call checklist attacks and graph attacks. And it's important to defend against both. Now, a checklist attack is typically an attack that involves exploiting a known vulnerability. And as IT pros, we've gotten really good at defending against this type of attack, because we've all seen those articles out there, and I've probably even written some of these. I'm sure I'm guilty of this, where it'll say, hey, do these 10 things to secure your Active Directory, and boy, are you going to be secure. That's the basis of a checklist attack. The attacker has the same type of checklist. Generally, it's something very similar to what you would use in a pen test or a penetration test, and the attacker just goes down the list. Have they secured against this vulnerability? Yes. Okay, what about this next one? Have they secured against that? No. Okay, well, we'll use that one to try to get in. So a checklist attack is exactly what it sounds like. The attacker is following a checklist of known vulnerabilities and finding out which vulnerabilities are still present on a system and which have been secured against. A graph-based attack is a little bit different, and this is one of those things that tend to get neglected by a lot of organizations. A graph-based attack is an attack in which an attacker has a starting point, and they have an endpoint objective that they're trying to achieve. And so they formulate an attack not by going through a checklist of vulnerabilities, but rather by looking at what steps would be required from where they're at now to help them to achieve that desired objective. Now, admittedly, there is some overlap between the two types of attacks. An attacker might use a checklist attack to initially penetrate the organization and then transition into a graph-based attack once they've made their way in. So there is some overlap. The two aren't completely separate from one another, but those are the two main types of attacks that you're going to have to defend against. So when we talk about hardening the Active Directory or your Azure AD environment, these are the two types of attacks that you need to be thinking about with regard to your strategy. So one of the first questions that you have to consider with regard to hardening your Active Directory and Azure AD environments is, what is the attacker's initial point of entry going to be? So regardless of which type of attack the attacker is going to use, they're going to have to initially breach your organization somehow. So how are they going to get in? Well, there are any number of ways that an attacker could potentially get in. This slide lists some of the more common ones. Outdated malware protection is a big one. New malware comes out every single day, and oftentimes a malware infestation will be designed to download some other component, and that component might allow backdoor entry into an organization, and that might act as an attacker's initial point of entry. Also, outdated patches, that's a really big one, because how many vulnerabilities have you seen that potentially allow for remote code execution? The attackers know this, and they also know that if you haven't applied a patch for that particular vulnerability, then they may be able to find a way to exploit that vulnerability and go in and execute code on your system. Also, disabled security features. This is another big one. At one time in IT, it was relatively common for IT pros to say, okay, I just cannot get this particular feature to work right, but if I go in and I turn this security feature off, lo and behold, it works, and everybody's happy because now this thing that everybody was asking me for suddenly works. And, I've seen that in the real world more times than I really care to admit. But this is one of those things that we just really can't afford to be doing anymore because the stakes are so much higher than they used to be. So disabling security features can lead to this initial entry that will allow for an attack to progress. Also, outdated applications. A lot of applications, just like operating systems, need to be patched, but that's not the only way that an application can be outdated is missing patches. An application can also be outdated if it's an older application that relies on older techniques such as legacy authentication. That's a big one. So look for outdated applications that can potentially contain a vulnerability that would allow an attacker to gain the initial entry into your system. And then another big one is excessive permissions. Now, there's been so much material written about excessive permissions, particularly with regard to zero trust and the idea of least user access and role-based access control and that sort of thing. But there's one important point that a lot of people miss with regard to excessive permissions, and that is this. Think about how long the Active Directory has been around. And I alluded to this a little bit in the first session, so I won't go into this in too much depth, but Active Directory was introduced with Windows 2000 way back in '99. And the concept of a domain has been around since Windows NT Server, dating back to 1994. So imagine for a moment that somebody implemented an Active Directory environment, a domain environment back in '94, and then they migrated to Windows 2000 at some point, and then over the years they migrated to newer and newer versions of Windows until we get to the point where we are today with domain controllers running on Windows Server 2022. That's great, but the problem with that is that all of those successive migrations that have happened over the years never really did away with the original structure. Sure, structural changes may have occurred, new Active Directory objects have been created, maybe some old ones have been deleted, but there's a really good chance that there are elements of that original domain structure that dates back decades that are still in place. So why is this so important? Well, if you really stop and think about it, if somebody put something into place at the time when a domain was first established, maybe they didn't fully understand the concept of a domain, or they didn't understand the implications of some of the configuration actions that they were taking. Well, that bad configuration decision that was made decades ago may have propagated over the years through one migration after another, and still be in place today. And oftentimes what you'll find is that that's tied to excessive permissions. Maybe there was a group that decades ago was given more permissions than it should have been, and that's still around today. So it's a good idea to dig into your Active Directory and take a really hard look at the permissions that are given to users and groups and just see if there's anything there that shouldn't be there. That's one of the most effective things that you can do to guard against an attacker making an initial point of entry. Now, when we start talking about Active Directory security, one of the things that I would recommend doing is taking a look at Secure Score and Identity Score, particularly if you're operating in the cloud. Now, these aren't new. They're things I've talked about a million times in different webcasts that I've done on this platform, but I keep mentioning them because they're important. So Secure Score is an element of Microsoft 365, which runs on Azure AD. So what it does is it takes a look at the way that your environment is configured, and it gives you a numerical score. And that score is a reflection of a percentage, or it's expressed as a percentage that is a reflection of points accumulated by performing certain security objectives. Here's what it looks like for anybody who may not have seen it. So in this case, the secure score is 18.65%, meaning that this particular environment could be a whole lot more secure than it really is. And you can see a comparison of your score compared to other organizations that are like yours. So you can kind of get a sense for where everybody else is at in terms of security, and if the way that your environment is secured is really out of whack compared to everybody else's. And there are also improvement actions that you can take to get your score up. So if you look toward the center of the screen near the bottom, you can see that we have top improvement actions. And Microsoft lists all these steps that you can take to improve the security of the environment. So for each one of these improvement actions, we have the action itself. In other words, what is it that you should be doing to improve your security? Then you can see a percentage next to that, and that's how much your score is going to increase by if you perform this particular action. Then you have status. So is this something that you've chosen to address? Is it something that you've decided to just accept the risk and not do? That's reflected in the status. And then you have a category. And in these cases, most of these improvement actions are tied to identity, although the one at the bottom is tied to apps. So that's just a really quick breakdown of Secure Score. Now, in addition to Secure Score, there's something called Identity Score. And Identity Score is tied more specifically to Azure AD. Now, the reason why Identity Score is so important is because a lot of people have suggested, this isn't something that I made up, other people deserve credit for this, that identity is the new perimeter. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you think about the way that security has always been handled in the past, security was tied to the network perimeter. In other words, there was a time, and granted it's been a while, though not really that long, but there was a time when we all had data centers and offices, and the way of thinking was that if you can keep the bad guys from coming into your four walls, and if you can keep users from sending anything sensitive outside of your four walls, then you're doing great. Everything's secure. You got nothing to worry about. That was the general way of thinking at the time. Now today, of course, that's absolutely ridiculous. That would never work. Because think about the way that things have changed. Whereas all of our applications used to be contained in the data center, now they're all scattered across a gazillion different clouds. We might still have some applications running in our data centers, but we might have other applications in Azure or on the Amazon cloud or who knows where else. We might subscribe to SaaS applications. So our data is no longer exclusively contained in our data center. Likewise, end users are no longer in the office, working from carefully curated domain-joined corporate desktops. Instead, they're largely working from home or other remote locations, and very often from personal devices. So the whole idea about defending the perimeter just doesn't even work anymore, because the perimeter is more or less non-existent. Everything is too widely scattered. So the idea behind identity being the new perimeter is that since we can't focus on securing the perimeter anymore, the next logical step is to work around securing user identities. So we've all got accounts, and those accounts are a favorite target of attackers because those accounts have permissions associated with them. So the best thing that you can do to protect your Active Directory environment is to secure those identities and those accounts that correspond to those identities. So getting back to the slide, this is where Azure AD comes into play. So as you can see, I'm in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and there are two great big blue arrows on the side. The top one is pointing to Azure Active Directory, so we go to that tab. And then the bottom blue arrow points to an option in the Manage section for Identity Secure Score. And when you click on that, you're taken to a screen that looks like this. And this is very, very similar to what I showed you a moment ago with the General Secure Score, but there are a couple of differences. This one is specific to identity, whereas the General Secure Score that I showed you a moment ago is more about keeping your Microsoft 365 environment secure. I went ahead and threw that in because Microsoft 365 does run on Azure AD, but this particular chart is specific to identity security. Now, if you look at the improvement actions, the one thing that I wanted to show you, besides the fact that some of the improvement actions that are listed are different from what you saw with the Secure Score screen, the very last column is implementation cost. The reason why that column exists is because a lot of the security mechanisms that exist for Azure AD require an Azure AD Premium subscription. So you're not necessarily going to be able to take all of the recommended actions if all you have is a basic Azure AD subscription. You may find that it's worthwhile to upgrade to one of the premium subscriptions if you want to take full advantage of all this. Now, another thing that I'll quickly mention before I move on is that whether we're talking about the Identity Secure Score or just the basic Secure Score that you get with Microsoft 365, it isn't necessarily realistic or even desirable to try to reach a score of 100%. Because every organization is different. We all have unique concerns, unique requirements. So a security setting that is appropriate for one organization might be totally disruptive for another organization, and it could even be detrimental to that organization's ability to function and for users to do their jobs. So you have to balance security with functionality. I've got a friend who used to say that if you want to make your data completely secure, then what you do is you unplug the server, stick it in a safe, and drop the safe to the bottom of the ocean. At that point, it's secure. Nobody's going to get to your data. But the data is not accessible at all, nor is it usable at that point. So it would kind of be a ridiculous thing to use if you care about your data. So the point being that you've got to balance functionality with security and do what's right for your own organization. So you don't want to be putting in security policies that make it impossible for users to do their job, especially if you're only implementing that policy in the interest of getting your score up. Now, as I was putting this presentation together, I was looking at several different statistics, and I found one from Microsoft, and you can see the source at the bottom of the slide. And this particular statistic said that, according to Microsoft, 97% of breaches were avoidable through simple or intermediate controls. 97%. Now, this report was a couple years old, but I'm assuming that the basic premise of this is still valid. You know, maybe the number has changed by a percentage point or two in one direction or the other, but the point remains that a huge percentage of security problems can be avoided just by using the controls that are already at your disposal. So that's a really big key takeaway when it comes to securing your Active Directory environment, is to make sure that you're making use of the tools that are available to you. You know, a lot of organizations will go in and set everything up and just kind of do the basics, but they're not as secure as they could be because there are security features that exist within Windows Server that maybe they haven't turned on or configured. Now, one of Microsoft's really big recommendations, and one of the first things that I would recommend to anybody who's concerned about Active Directory security, is to enable multi-factor authentication. And there was an article from Microsoft. Again, I've provided a link at the bottom of the slide if anyone wants to check this out. And according to this article, which was a couple of years old, at that time, there were over 300 million fraudulent sign-in attempts to the Microsoft Cloud every single day. And Microsoft went on to say that multi-factor authentication could block 99.9% of account compromise attacks. So 300 million per day. Think about that for a moment. This was a couple of years ago, but that's 300 million attacks every single day just on the Microsoft Cloud. That's not even counting attacks against on-premises environments or other clouds or SaaS applications or things like that. This is just attacks targeted at things like Azure and Microsoft 365. And the number's probably gone up since then. And just to put that number into context, 300 million, that was roughly the population of the United States at that time. So you figure, like, every single person in the country making an attack against Azure AD every single day, that's roughly the scope of what we're talking about here. And Microsoft was saying that multi-factor authentication can block almost all of those attacks. So whether you believe that statistic or not, I do think that it underscores the idea that multi-factor authentication is one of the most effective things that you can use for keeping your identity secure. Now, in some organizations, there are logistical issues that prevent the use of multi-factor authentication. I get that. And there's even a slide on that a little bit later on in the presentation if I make it that far. So what I would suggest is if you're not able to implement multi-factor authentication across the board, do it where you can. At the very least, make sure that any privileged accounts are secured by multi-factor authentication. And then if you've got some users that use an application that simply can't work with multi-factor authentication, turn multi-factor authentication on for everybody else. Just, let those users who can't use it continue to use legacy authentication, but transition everybody else to using multi-factor authentication. Some security is better than no security. So here's some more statistics from Microsoft from that page that I mentioned a moment ago. So I'll just quickly go over some of these. At the time, and this was in 2019, so this is a couple years old, but Microsoft was saying that every day they were seeing 4,000 ransomware attacks, 300 million fraudulent sign-in attacks, and 167 million daily malware attacks. And then they went on to say that 81% of breaches are caused by credential theft, which 81%, that's a big percentage, so that's something that is hard to ignore. So protecting against credential theft is obviously something really important that you should be doing in your organization. They go on to say that 73% of the passwords that are being used are duplicates. So what that refers to is maybe a user who is forced to change the password that they use to log into their network, and they use that same password on their social media accounts or their Amazon account or whatever else, just because they've got so many passwords that they have to remember, so they use the same password for multiple sites. That's what it means by password duplicates, and that's obviously something that you want to avoid at all costs. Also, 50% of employees use apps that aren't approved by the enterprise. So if you got an unsanctioned application that a user is using, that application can contain vulnerabilities that an attacker could potentially exploit to gain access to anything that that user has access to. So that's something else that I'm going to be talking a little bit about as I go on. Now, when it comes to multi-factor authentication, I think that it's really important to talk about balance. I mentioned a moment ago the example about taking your data, sticking it in a safe, and dropping it to the bottom of the ocean being wildly impractical. Well, this is one of those examples where you have to balance security with practicality, because nobody wants to have to complete a multi-factor authentication prompt every single time that they log in or try to access a particular resource or something like that. Nobody wants to be pestered by constant, okay, if a code is being sent to your phone, you got to enter this code, and it's a pain. Nobody wants to deal with that. So what you can do is you can limit the number of multi-factor authentication prompts that your users receive. And Microsoft provides a mechanism within Azure AD that you can use to do that. Now, there are two options that you need to be aware of. The first one is the option to stay signed in. You can see what that looks like on the screen right there. And that's something that even if you haven't necessarily turned that on in Azure AD, your users may periodically see this prompt. They'll log in to maybe Microsoft 365 or something like that, and they'll see a prompt like this one asking them if they want to stay signed in, and that will reduce the number of times that they're prompted to enter a password. That's a great convenience feature for end users, assuming that they're working from a trusted device. Now, the other option is an option to remember multi-factor authentication for X number of days, and as an admin, you can tell Azure AD how many days that is. So what that means is that, let's say that you've required multi-factor authentication in your organization. A user logs onto their device, they complete the multi-factor authentication challenge, and at that point, Windows knows, okay, they're working from this particular device. They've already completed multi-factor authentication. If they log in an hour from now on the same device using the same account, they're probably who they claim to be. So there's really no reason to make them complete this multi-factor authentication challenge again. So you can set it up so that Windows doesn't ask for them to complete that multi-factor authentication every single time that they log in. You can set it so that that's valid for so many days, assuming that they're working from the same device. Now, one thing that I do want to quickly mention about this is that these options are mutually exclusive. You can either use the stay signed in option or you can use the remember multi-factor authentication option, but you can't use them both at the same time. They'll interfere with one another. So there's a link at the bottom of the slide to a page that you can go to learn more if you're curious about this sort of thing. Now, another important thing that you can do with regard to keeping your Active Directory environment secure is to make sure that you're auditing the Active Directory and reviewing the audit logs. So this is one of those things that's really important, but it's often neglected. Now, according to Microsoft, 85% of security incidents that occurred took weeks or even longer to discover. And of those incidents, 92% were discovered by a third party. So what that really means is that an organization has a security incident and they don't even know about it. But a few weeks later, they've got a consultant or somebody coming in doing some IT work for them, and that consultant just happens to look at something in the logs and finds that incident that occurred that the organization totally missed. And according to these statistics, it would suggest that this is something that's super common. So definitely worth paying attention to. And then Microsoft goes on to say that investigators noted that 66% of victims had sufficient evidence available within their logs to discover the breach had they been more diligent in analyzing the resources. So I just wanted to put this out there because it's really important not just to make sure that you're logging Active Directory activity, but also taking the time to analyze those logs. And you don't have to do it manually. There are many tools out there that can perform log file aggregation and search your logs for anything that might signal that an attack is happening or that a breach has occurred. So you've got the evidence in the log files, and it's important that you use that information. Now, another thing that you can and should be doing is to train your users. Because really, at the end of the day, your users are probably your biggest security vulnerability. Because remember, whatever size organization you've got, whether you've got 10 people or 10,000 people, you've got users. Those users have certain permissions associated with their accounts, and each one of those users has the potential to inflict at least some level of damage to the organization if they do something dumb, such as falling for a phishing attack or unleashing ransomware or something like that. That's a perfect argument for implementing least privilege access and zero trust, but it's also an important argument for educating your users on what they should and should not be doing online. So it's really important to establish a culture of security awareness. Initially, this means using strong passwords, taking steps to protect the devices that the users are working from to the best that you can. That can be a bit tricky if users are working from personal devices, but do what you can. And then enabling security features wherever you can do that. Now, another thing that you can do if you happen to be using Microsoft 365 is attack simulation training. I don't want to go into this in too much depth because there's a lot of other things that I want to cover, and I'm not sure I'm going to have time to get to all of them. But the idea behind attack simulation training is that Microsoft 365 has a built-in tool that you can use to launch a simulated phishing attack against your users. And the simulated phishing attack is designed to look completely real and to mimic real-world phishing attacks in pretty much every way, just to see who falls for it. And if a user does fall for it, then you can show them what they've done wrong, what the telltale signs was that this message that they fell for wasn't legit. And you can even require training for the users who fell for that attack. So let me just show you a couple of screen captures in case you've never seen this before, and you can see what this looks like. So here we are signed into Microsoft 365 in one of the administrative consoles, and the console asks you what type of phishing attack you want to perform. Now on this screen, credential harvest is the only option that's highlighted. The others are grayed out. And the reason for that is that the options that are available to you vary depending on your subscription level. In my case, I've got an Enterprise E3 subscription, so credential harvesting attacks are the only option that I have. So when you select the attack, you're taken to the Select Payload screen. And the idea behind this screen is that there are a number of different phishing messages that you can choose from, and these messages vary by type. So right now, I've selected a security upgrade message, and you can see a sample of what such a message would look like. So we have a message with a body that says something like, recent server update, kindly update to the latest security update to enhance your email functionality. Update now, be aware Office 365 will not be responsible for any loss of data should this warning be neglected. So that's what the phishing message looks like, and the message would obviously differ if you were to choose a different payload. So you send it out, you choose who you want the message sent to, and then when a user gets the message, if they open it and they click on the link in the message, they're going to see a message kind of like this saying, it's okay, you're human, let's learn from this. And then it goes on to say, hey, you were just phished, but rather than stealing your credentials, let's take a look at what you could have done different. So then you get taken to this screen, and it actually steps the user through various parts of the message that show them that, hey, this was probably a phishing attack rather than a legitimate email. So it gives them some things to look for in future emails. And because there are so many different messages that you can choose from, you can periodically go back and launch new phishing attacks against your users to see if they've learned anything from the previous ones. And if a user does indeed fall for a phishing attack, then you have the ability to require them to take some training. And these training modules are really short and simple. You can see that this one says that it should take 3 minutes. In reality, it's probably more like 30 seconds. But here's an example of what that training looks like. Microsoft 365 will present a situation and then ask the user, what do you think that they should do? And then they answer a multiple choice question. And then the software will tell them why or why not their choice was the best one. So one of the really important things that I wanted to talk about is that we hear a lot in this day and age about phishing attacks and all of the horrible things that happen as a result of phishing attacks. You know, phishing attacks can lead to anything from credential theft to ransomware infections and much, much more. But there is one other type of attack that comparatively few people talk about, and that is QR code-based attacks. And this is one of those things that, even though it's not receiving a lot of attention, these attacks can be absolutely devastating, and they're so simple for an attacker to pull off. All they have to do is replace a legitimate QR code with a malicious one that's designed to perform some sort of unwanted activity, and then when someone scans one of these QR codes, then they end up falling victim to the attack. So I wanted to talk about that because these types of attacks, even though they're directed at consumers and their mobile devices, if someone uses that particular mobile device for work, then a QR code attack could end up impacting your Active Directory environment, even though this isn't directly related to the Active Directory. So let's take a look at what this looks like. What I've got on screen right now is a QR code generator, and there are a million of these. I just picked one at random off the internet and opened it up. So what this does is it allows you to generate a QR code for a specific purpose. In this case, I picked the URL option, and then I specified a URL, and the software generated a QR code that would direct a device to go to that URL. Now, in this case, I just pointed it to my own website, but you can only imagine what an attacker would do. They could create a QR code that leads to a malicious URL that would cause ransomware to be downloaded to a device. So that's one example. You can also create QR codes that will automatically launch or send a tweet or make a Bitcoin payment or download something from the App Store or send a text message or send an email message. There are all kinds of things that you can do with QR codes. So you can imagine how devastating these codes could be in the wrong hands. Now, one of the things that makes QR codes so problematic is that, unlike an email message, QR codes aren't human readable. So if us as IT pros receive a phishing message, there are certain things that we look for right away and realize, hey, this is a phishing message. I'm not clicking on anything. QR codes are a different story because take a look at that QR code on the screen. I can't read that. I'm assuming you probably can't either. So just to look at that, there's no way of knowing if that's malicious or if that's legitimate. That's why QR code attacks are such a problem. So what can you do about it? Well, the first thing is to just accept the idea that users work from personal devices and that QR code attacks are real and that they do happen. Unfortunately, it's one of the sad truths of life. Another thing that you can do is to make sure that any user who is working from a personal device to do work stuff, make sure that there is a certain minimum amount of security software that's installed on that device. Protect the device to the best of your ability. Now, that's not always easy if the user is working from a personal device because there are device sovereignty issues that come into play. There are also licensing issues that may come into play. But if you can pull off getting security software installed on the device that will protect against device takeover attacks and that sort of thing, then that will only help you. And that would be one of my number one recommendations. Another thing, require multi-factor authentication. Because again, if a user scans a malicious QR code and that QR code attempts to do something bad, then if you're requiring multi-factor authentication, that might be the one thing that puts a stop to that attack. Also, work toward implementing passwordless authentication. Use a multi-factor authentication for now, but take advantage of authentication options that aren't based around passwords. Right now, you can't use passwordless authentication for absolutely everything, but there are things that you can use it for. So start adopting that technology wherever you can. So another best practice, getting back more into the Active Directory side of things, is to make sure that you use dedicated admin accounts. So this is another important one. From a convenience standpoint, it's usually a lot easier just to use one account for everything. But from a security standpoint, that's a terrible practice, because if your account is taken over, then whatever permissions your account has, that's the permissions that the attacker has. So you really don't want to be using a privileged account for anything that doesn't require privileges, because you want to minimize the chances that that account will ever be compromised. So in smaller organizations, that might mean creating two separate accounts for each administrator, one with privileges, one without. In larger, more sophisticated organizations, that might mean using one account for each administrator, but using something like PIM or Privileged ID Management, so that those privileges are delivered when they're needed, but the rest of the time that admin is treated as a standard user. Also, if an admin is logged in using a privileged account, make sure that those accounts are set up for multi-factor authentication, and also make sure that before the admin signs out, close out any browser sessions, log out of anything that may be open, and just make sure and close any browsers before switching from one account to the next. So another important thing to protect your Active Directory environment is to do what you can to protect the organization against malware. So what can you do there? Well, the really obvious thing is blocking or using anti-malware software. But beyond that, there are attachment types that should be blocked within inbound and outbound email messages. So that way, if somebody emails you an executable file, you can just block that before anybody has the chance to click on it and do something bad to your organization. Another recommendation would be don't disable Microsoft Defender. I've seen lots of people that have gone in and turned off Microsoft Defender inside of Windows because they consider it to be ineffective, or because they've got other anti-malware software. I would say if the anti-malware software that you're installing doesn't disable Defender, then you probably shouldn't manually disable it, because Defender is one of those things that hasn't really saved me from a lot of situations over the years, but every once in a while I have seen it step up to the plate and catch something. On this slide, for example, you can see that PowerShell is actually integrated with Defender. I was creating a script that was designed to mimic viral activity because I was doing a session on PowerShell security a while back. And in the course of writing this PowerShell code, Defender actually stepped in and said, hey, this might be a malicious script. You may not want to run this. So you can see that Defender does do something. Also, a while back, I ended up running a full-blown Defender scan on one of my network shares. And this has been several years ago, but when I did that, it ended up finding a piece of malware that had lied dormant on a file server for 17 years. I'm talking about something that none of my other anti-malware software had caught, and yet, for whatever reason, Defender ended up catching it. So Defender does have its place, and I would recommend not disabling it. Now, I talked a little bit about passwords earlier and how you should transition toward not using passwords if at all possible. But the reality is that, at least for right now, passwords are here to stay. I think we will, within the next few years, maybe a little longer than a few years, but we will eventually hit the point where passwords become a thing of the past. But for right now, they are something that we have to deal with. So it's important to consider password best practices. Because remember what I said earlier. Identity is the new perimeter. You want to defend your Active Directory, you defend identities. And a big part of defending identities is password management. So one of the big things that has come out, and it's somewhat controversial, but NIST, Microsoft, and some of the other security agencies are now recommending against not expiring passwords automatically. They're saying that there's no reason to make a user change their password every month or every 2 months or whatever, just for the sake of changing the password. It's a lot better to just use a really long, complicated password, and unless that password has been compromised, there's no reason to change it. Now, that doesn't work in every situation because organizations in regulated industries have to consider what the regulations say. One of the regulations, I believe it's HIPAA, requires changing your password every 60 days. So in a situation like that, you would have to do what the regulation dictates rather than password best practices. But for everybody else, it's important to acknowledge the idea that password best practices do evolve over time, and that you should periodically review what NIST and Microsoft and others are advising. So here are the latest NIST guidelines as of November 2021. According to NIST, password length is a lot more important than complexity. They also recommend against enforcing regular password resets, just for the sake of resetting your password. They also recommend that you screen all new passwords against a list of commonly used and compromised passwords. So why is this important? Well, imagine for a moment that an attacker goes after a large organization and they harvest credentials from that organization. The benefit of those harvested credentials go beyond those specific accounts that were compromised. Let's say they harvest the password. What they would do is separate that password from the account that it goes with, and then they would perform a hash of that password and then add that password hash to a database along with the password itself. So then, if the attacker later attempts to infiltrate another organization and they get a hold of a list of hash credentials, rather than having to do a brute force crack of all of those credentials, they take those hashes and compare it against the database and see if there were any hits. So if a password that somebody is using has been previously compromised, even in a different organization by a different user, then the hash of that password is likely going to be in a database, making it really easy to decipher that password. So it's really important to avoid using passwords that are known to have been compromised. So there are a number of third-party tools that will allow you to check user passwords against passwords that are known to be compromised. And I'm pretty sure that there is also a mechanism within Azure AD that will allow you to do that as well. Another NIST recommendation is to allow pasting of passwords. Some organizations disable copying and pasting of passwords because they think that it makes it more secure. And in some environments it might, but if a user has a really long, complicated password, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and allow them to copy and paste that if necessary, just because that kind of discourages writing down or just a lot of tedious typing. Also, give the user the option of showing the password as they type it. You know, certainly that shouldn't be the default behavior, but at least give the user that option, because if the user is able to, or let me rephrase that, if the user is having a little bit of trouble entering the password correctly, if they're able to enable that option to show the password, then maybe they can see where they're mistyping something and they can avoid an account lockout. Which brings me to the next best practice. Limit the number of failed password attempts before the lockout. And then from there, implement two-factor authentication. So we're starting to see a trend, multi-factor authentication for practically everything. And then salt and hash the passwords. So another best practice is turn on sign-in risk policy. The idea here being that conditional access policies can be used to assess sign-in risk. So if you have an Azure AD Premium subscription, you should turn on sign-in risk policy. I'll come back to this one in a little bit. And then another best practice is do not allow users to grant consent to unmanaged applications. This goes back to one of those things that I talked about earlier. If a user installs an application that's not sanctioned by the organization, there's always the chance that that application contains an exploitable vulnerability. Because remember, this isn't something the organization has approved, so they may not have taken the time to test this particular application. Or it's also possible that the reason they didn't approve it was because the application is known to be buggy or vulnerable or what have you. So it's a good idea to prevent users from installing applications that aren't sanctioned by the organization, because that can help prevent the user's account from being compromised. Because if a user installs that application, they generally, if they're installing it on a mobile device, have to grant consent for that application to perform various actions on the device. And the user may not fully understand or appreciate the implications of the application performing those actions. And remember, all it really takes is one bad click. So Azure Active Directory actually has a mechanism built in that you can use to prevent users from installing things that you didn't authorize. So here we are in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And I've gone into the Manage section, and you can see that there's a setting called User Consent Settings. And when you select the setting, you see some descriptive text telling you that when end users and group owners are allowed to grant consent to applications and when they will be required to request administrative review and approval. Allowing users to grant apps access to data helps them acquire useful applications and to be productive, but can represent a risk in some situations if it's not monitored and controlled carefully. So then it goes on to say, configure whether users are allowed to consent for applications to access your organization's data. And we have three options here. Do not allow user consent, allow user consent for apps from verified publishers for selected permissions, and that's Microsoft's recommended action. And then the other option is allow user consent for apps. So then we also have the screen. There are two options I wanted to point out on here. One is users can add gallery apps to My Apps. You can set this to yes or to no to control what the users are able to do. And then the other thing is you can set it so that applications require administrative consent, and you can automatically expire those requests after a certain number of days if necessary. Now, another best practice with regard to Active Directory security is to designate a single Azure AD directory as the authoritative source for corporate and organizational accounts. Now, why is this? Well, I'm not talking about multi-tenancy here. Multi-tenancy definitely has its place, and there are perfectly legitimate business use cases for that. So that's not at all what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is situations where organizations accidentally accumulate Azure AD footprints. So imagine, for example, that, 10 years ago, an organization decides to adopt Microsoft 365. So they break out the corporate credit card, they set up a Microsoft 365 subscription, and Microsoft 365 depends on Azure AD. So it comes with Azure AD baked into it. Then a couple years later, the organization decides, hey, I'm hearing an awful lot about this Azure cloud. Let's set up an Azure subscription. So they set up an Azure account, and then somewhere along the way, somebody sets up Active Directory in that Azure subscription. And maybe they even set up Azure AD Connect to synchronize the on-premises Active Directory up to Azure AD. Well, at that point, the organization has Active Directory resources on premises, they have it in Azure AD, and they have it in Microsoft 365. So we've got three separate Active Directory footprints. Now, in some ways, Azure AD and the on-premises Active Directory can be thought of as one because Azure AD Connect synchronizes accounts between the two. But that doesn't change the fact that you've got two separate Azure AD environments, one in Microsoft 365 and the other in Azure itself. Now, this is problematic primarily because it increases the footprint. You have an expanded attack surface because you've got two separate Active Directory environments in the Azure cloud, one in Microsoft 365, one in Azure itself. So it's a good idea to go ahead and try to consolidate that if at all possible. That could be really tedious to do. It could be a little messy. You might even break things along the way. But it may be a very worthwhile endeavor if you've got multiple Azure Active Directories out there servicing the same batch of users. It will shrink the potential attack surface, and it will make management easier down the road. So I just looked at the clock, and I want to be sure and save a little bit of time for questions here at the end. So I'm going to skip past some of these other best practices. There are two other things that I want to quickly talk about before we run out of time. One best practice is to leverage conditional access policies if you've got an Azure AD premium subscription. And if you don't have an Azure AD premium subscription, this may be a good reason to get one. Conditional access policies, if you're not familiar with them, are similar to if-then statements, and they can go a really, really long way toward improving your overall security, and they can also help you with your zero trust initiatives. Conditional access policies are kind of like if-then statements. Now, normally when a user logs in, they enter a password, and we have one if-then statement. If the password is correct, then give the user access to everything that they have access to. Conditional access policies are a more sophisticated version of that because they don't just look at whether or not the user logged in successfully. They take other considerations into account when deciding whether or not the user should be granted access to resources. It isn't enough just for the user to have logged in successfully and to have access to a particular resource. because it's not always desirable to give the user access to resources that they would ordinarily have access to. Let's say that a user goes in and they try to access a particular resource at 9 a.m. every Monday morning. That's a normal pattern of behavior, and there's probably no real risk there. If, on the other hand, that same user logs in at 3 o'clock in the morning from a rogue nation on the other side of the world when they were just in the office a few hours ago, that's probably a sign that someone's attacking your network, and it's not in your best interest to allow that user account to access that resource that they legitimately have access to. This is where conditional access policies come into play. Conditional access policies are like if-then statements. They look at various conditions and make a decision based on the conditions that are being evaluated. So what kind of conditions? Well, there's a long list, but here are a few of the more common ones. You can look at things like what groups that the user is a member of, what type of device the user is working from. So, for example, you might choose to allow a user to access a really sensitive resource if they're in the office working from a domain-joined corporate desktop, but not allow access if the user is sitting at home trying to access that resource from their iPhone. You can also look at the operating system version. If the user is working from a mobile device, you can check if that device has been jailbroken or not. You can look to see if the user is working from a device that's using a trusted IP address range. You can check the user's country or region and the data that's being accessed. So those are a few of the things that conditional access policies can look at when deciding whether or not to allow access to a particular resource. Now, the one other thing that I wanted to quickly talk about before we run out of time here is the 10 immutable laws of security. Now, I didn't make these up. There's a link at the bottom of the slide to a place where you can go and find these. But these are 10 philosophies that generally hold very, very true when it comes to securing the Active Directory or anything else that you may want to secure. So I thought that it might be a good use of time to just go ahead and go over a few of these. Law number 1, if a bad guy can persuade you to run his program on your computer, it's not solely your computer anymore. Some of these are hard truths, but they're sobering. They give you some things to think about. Law 2, if a bad guy can alter the operating system on your computer, it's not your computer anymore. Law 3, if a bad guy has unrestricted physical access to your computer, it's not your computer anymore. So these first 3 laws tend to pertain more to endpoints rather than Active Directory, but these are still important philosophies for security. Law 4, if you allow a bad guy to run active content in your website, it's not your website anymore. Law 5, weak passwords trump strong security. So again, here's that need for strong passwords, for following password best practices, and eventually moving beyond passwords to authentication systems that don't rely on passwords. Law 6, a computer is only as secure as the administrator is trustworthy. So that one is a good argument for delegation of permissions and using role-based access control. Law 7, encrypted data is only as secure as its decryption key. Law 8, an out-of-date anti-malware scanner is only marginally better than no scanner at all, so keep those malware or anti-malware applications up to date. Law 9, absolute anonymity isn't practically achievable online or offline. And Law 10, technology is not a panacea. So with that said, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and I want to go ahead and open it up for questions.
All right, thanks, Brian. We actually only have time for one question, so I will go as broad as possible. This question comes in from Lowell. Can everything ever be truly secure?
Absolutely not. There's always going to be some element of risk. One of the philosophies in security is that your security protocols also make you predictable. So if you adhere rigorously to the list of best practices and everybody knows you follow those best practices, well then the simple fact that you're following those best practices means the bad guys know how you're conducting your security operations, and they can develop countermeasures for those security protocols that you adhere to. So, you know, it's always a game of security measures and countermeasures. I don't think we'll ever achieve total security.
Okay, with that, we are out of time. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you for having me.